Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for making it to the end of the summit. Our final session is all about federal grant dollars that are available for the K-12 community and how you, your school, and your community can access those to improve the safety and security in your communities. We're joined today by experts from across the country who have firsthand experience receiving grants. And I want to start just with some introductions about who they are, the organizations they represent, and the grants that they've applied for and had success with. Amra, would you get us started?
Sure, of course. First of all, thank you, Don, for inviting me to this very important conversation. My name is Amra Sabic-El-Rayess. I'm a professor and researcher at Columbia University's Graduate School of Education, Health, and Psychology. I am also the author of The Cat They Never Named in 3 Summers, 2 stories of resilience to hate, 2 memoirs that capture my own survival during the Bosnian genocide. And most importantly, I work through Columbia and beyond Columbia on prevention of targeted violence. And today I'm here because I have been a recipient of several innovation grants. And today I'll talk about Reimagine Resilience given by DHS, Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, specifically their Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Grant. And I do want to uplift CP3 in our conversation today because they are an incredible team of dedicated individuals who have made my research and work possible through their support. And I want to thank them for that. And I want to thank federal government for their support on particularly early prevention of targeted violence.
Good afternoon. Salam alaikum. My name is Suzan Samaha. I use the pronouns she, her. I come to you as a Muslim Egyptian American and really excited for this conversation. So thank you, Don. Thank you for creating space for us. I am the Assistant Director of the EDI Center, which is the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Center at the Minnesota Department of Education. And so as a lifelong learner, I am really excited to be in space with other folks around the state, sharing the work that centers our students in a way that's humanizing, in a way that's dignifying, because that's what education is about, is teaching us to have more empathy and centering ways to be a collective community to do what's best. And so I'm here today to talk about the Stronger Connections Grant, which is all about community engagement and making our communities stronger. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am Diane Wyatt. I am the Director of Safe Schools for the School District of Palm Beach County. And one of the main focuses within my department is looking that we provide a safe place to learn for all kids and that we are meeting their needs. And I have found that through the grants in which my department have received, especially from the Stop Prevention grants for stopping violence and doing that preventative piece, that after having been in education for 34 years now, that I've seen a vast change in the way in which we address safety on campus. And I'm a firm believer that addressing it with preventative measures is important. And the grants have been key in helping establish many preventative features on our campus in Palm Beach County that I'd love to tell you about today.
Thanks for introducing each of yourselves and the programs you're with. I'd love to learn more about the grant programs that you decided to apply for, what your experience was like in applying for them, and the process that you and your teams went through to decide what to apply for.
Yes, thank you, Don, for the question. So my role as the Assistant Director in the Equity Center, we have the privilege of having several grants. So I get to oversee non-exclusionary discipline. I get to oversee anti-bias trauma-informed. We also have practices and trainings for the entire state around restorative practice. And we really uplift that as a practice and strategy in all of our work. And so the grant that that I'm focusing in on today in this conversation is the Stronger Connections Grant. And all of our grants they go through a framework that we have in our EDI center. And this is really important because it invites people into a shared values conversation, a shared beliefs conversation about all our children. And so I will just briefly read our belief statement from the EDI Center. It says, "We believe that our work is both personal and collective, requiring each of us to develop a critical consciousness that fosters beliefs, behaviors, and practices that eliminate harm, values our diverse human experience, and cultivates environments that dismantle racism and all oppressions." And so the words that I want to lift up in our conversation today is eliminating harm. There's a lot happening every day in schools and in our community. And so this grant really allows for us to have a conversation, an honest conversation around how do we eliminate harm. And so for us, when we received the opportunity to work with the grant, we want to emphasize and uplift the critical consciousness of who gets to apply to our grant, right? We want everyone to have access to applying. And so one thing we did was provide equity considerations. So as we know, some school districts have a grant writer. Other smaller schools like charter schools don't have grant writers. We didn't want that to be a barrier for work that needs to be done in our communities. And so we created equity considerations as a way to invite community members to apply. We also paid and we gave stipends for people to apply to be reviewers from our community, so that they also were part of the process from the beginning to ensure that when we say who receives the Stronger Connections grant, that community is part of that co-creating of the application, co-creating of community knows best, and they're going to work with us to help us do best for eliminating harm.
One of the things that we have found is that first step needs to be start with your data. Where is it showing that you have an area in which you want to address? So taking that data and then bringing all the stakeholders that own the data and its results and the way to measure it and how to implement interventions with it all to the table at one time helps, because you're able with such a large process to truly dig in, because many times you're not going to have a large turnaround time for when you get notice of a grant being open versus to when that final due date is there. And you've got to have the entire idea conceptualized of what you want to accomplish and what your target goal at the end is very quickly. And you want to make sure that you've got the right people at the table that are there to help do that. So that's one of the lessons learned that we've had, is that when those our grant department brings it to our attention and truly gives out the objectives for that grant and what areas in which it's qualified, that we get the right people at the table. We're looking at real-time data that we can use to measure and monitor as we move through for it. And the last piece, is that you're going to be able to take that work and implement it and truly follow it with a vision that's already clear. So the writing and setting it up ahead of time, I think, is really important. Having the right people there is huge, but truly knowing what you want to accomplish for a target when many times it's moving is hard to nail down. But having the right experts at the table during that discussion makes that conversation so much more clearer for an end result.
If I could add to what Diane and Suzanne have shared, it's very important to feel passionate and committed to this work. Work on violence prevention is difficult. It's difficult emotionally for all of us who are involved. And so for those interested in this arena of research and impact, it is important to determine what are you passionate about? What do you deeply care about in terms of ultimately having impact on society in your schools, in your communities? for me, the opportunity with this particular grant, working with CP3, emerged quite spontaneously. It was in the midst of pandemic. I was teaching a class on social transformations to my master's and PhD students at Columbia. And most students felt disconnected from what was happening in the world. They were pessimistic about the future. We engaged in a genuine dialogue and asked the question, what would change that feeling within our community? What would give them a sense of purpose? And they said, Dr. Amra, can we really do something about violence prevention? And so we started initially with $2,000, and $2,000 funded our pilot project that focused on understanding the depth and breadth of anti-Muslim racism. And I often call it racism because it is more than just Islamophobia in US schools. And based on that research, and once they've realized and recognized the impact that they could have through research, they expressed interest in continuing to work with me. And so we decided to apply to CP3 for an innovation grant that created Reimagine Resilience, which is evidence-based professional training program that centers on building resilience to hate in our schools. And I do have to mention some of my students, graduate students, for instance, a graduate student, Vic Joshi, who was going to study India's constitution when he came to study philosophy at Columbia University. And by working on these projects with me, has now shifted his work to study resilience to hate. Or Tina Kiswani, who was a senior leader in an education company who decided to leave that work and running a group of 40 or 50 tech experts to actually work on violence prevention. And so not only are we impacting communities within which we are working, but we ourselves are inspired and impacted by that work. And so I just want to highlight that having passion, audacity to be innovative, to think differently, to think more broadly, to engage more deeply and genuinely with communities that we impact is very, very important. And it's also very transformative for those of us who take this work with a great deal of responsibility.
I'd like to hear a little bit more about what the impacts of the grant programs and the dollars that you've received. What's been the impact on the safety and security of your communities, of your schools, and on students? Dan, can you talk to us a little bit about what that's looked like for you?
Definitely. And this is one of the ones where, as our grant process has evolved and we have continued to apply for the Department of Justice grant, that one, I started seeing a pattern. Our first year applying for this grant was in 2019 when I first became director of Safe Schools. And in it, we partnered with Sandy Hook Promise. And we wanted to be able to allow our students to understand the importance of having a voice. So we partnered with them on See Something, Say Something. In that grant, we put forth a presentation for our students, 6th grade through 12th grade. We were fortunate during that time that we were able to go into 67 different schools in our district and reach 93,450 students. And they all heard that message of when you see something, say something, do something. And that do something shouldn't be posted on social media, but find the adult that can help you with this piece. We also, in that grant, added in Saved Promise Clubs. And if you've never heard of a Saved Promise Club, it's Students Against Violence Everywhere. And we now have Saved Clubs on every one of our secondary campuses. Now, that was my first dip into the Department of Justice grant. The next year when it came out, we brought that team together again to start looking at the data and seeing what we could do about it. And we discovered that our students actually reporting to our different systems of areas and things on campus that they considered unsafe that they were seeing had definitely increased. And we wanted to make sure, the next thought process is, well, we're getting the reports, they're doing what we're asking them to do. How are we as adults handling that? So when we started writing our next grant proposal for the 2020 school year, we wrote it on school-based threat assessments. These threats were being turned in. How do we handle that? And we have a school police within our district, and we have our school-based administrators. We're the 10th largest district in the nation. So we've got, close to 200,000 students, a lot of employees. And where the school-based administrators were getting their guidance on how to handle that was coming both from the law enforcement side and from the academic side. We wrote a grant that collaborates, and we stand side by side with our school police, and we give the same message so that we are covering all bases needed for a safe environment when those threats come in. So we then have trained over 4,000 people, school-based administrators and administrative teams on our campuses on how to be consistent with the way in which they gather the information, investigate, report it, and most importantly, providing those safety and monitoring plans for the students that are being affected by it. So that became our second Department of Justice grant. When the third year came around, it's what are we going to do now? Looking at the data of how it was perceived and going through COVID and our return, we were discovering that so much of the reporting coming into us was talking about the mental health of our students. And we already had youth mental health first aid within our district, but I had 2 employees that were trained as one of only 15 in the nation to be teen mental health first aid providers. So we ended up writing a grant this next time. The first grant for Sandy Hook was $500,000 to do that process. We got $750,000 to do the threat management piece. So we decided, let's go big or go home. So the third grant we wrote was for $1 million, and we were funded for the $1 million. And we are bringing teen mental health first aid to our students, our 10th graders. So far, we've reached over 19,000 10th graders and providing them with that inside toolbox of how to recognize signs within themselves or their peers or family members that mental health support is needed. We also wanted to kind of couple that one with a Safe Schools Ambassadors. That is a group of students on campus that the principals chose 30 to 40 kids from a wide variety of groups on campus to get student leaders and give them the skills of how to be a peer interventionist on campus and helping their peers with things that they were seeing firsthand. Bullying incidents, threat incidents, that type, and giving them a true student voice and being a leader on campus as a student. So that became our third grant. Fourth year came in, and from that data we were seeing a lot of kids in that reacclimation coming back to school from COVID, dealing with the mental health issues, that our tier 2 and our tier 3 supports for students that dealt with those past the individual, but the very specific behavior situations that were coming in needed to be addressed. So we wanted to build intervention teams on every campus, all 180 campuses throughout our district. So we brought in another $1 million grant in order to have an intervention team of 3 to 5 individuals on every campus that is trained in how to look at a student's behavior and give appropriate interventions that are research-based to that student and those teachers working with that student to monitor the behavior and help change that behavior to one in which didn't require removal from a campus or moving into another area. So that became our tier 2 and 3 intervention piece. We also wanted to couple that with restorative practices. So in this coming year, all of our secondary schools are going to have restorative practice teams on campus. And the last year of the grant is something I can't wait to see happen. We are going to choose 5 to 7 campuses that have implemented that restorative practice and trained peer mediation groups and have student-led restorative practices on those high school campuses. So after getting 4 grants, I really did not think my chance of getting a 5th one was there, because they had already given us $3,250,000 in the last 4 years, but we went for it. So we go for the 4th or 5th year of our grant. And this last one that we just got, we want to be able to pair our most vulnerable kids on campus with a caring adult. Because in one of our student effectiveness questionnaires, we were finding that students weren't making that connection with a true trusted adult on campus, and we wanted to build those relationships. So this last grant is a check-in, check-out grant, where we are going to pair students on campus with trusting adults, help build the knowledge of that trusting adult of how to work with that child and be able to effectively help them coach from everything from the how do I deal with getting into college, the stress of exams, to any other issue in which they want to bring to the table, that they know who they can go to. And I had looked at many pieces of technology to do that and decided, I think we've got the knowledge within our district to maybe build our own. So we included in that grant money in order to build an app that will allow that trusted adult and that student to make connections on a daily basis for how are you doing. And when that trusted adult is not available, to have a resource center that will connect kids with the agencies within our community for on-demand, firsthand support.
Reimagine Resilience, which is a professional training program for educators that is focused on building resilience to hate through storytelling, diverse storytelling, and nonviolent problem solving. But just to give you a little bit of a background, years ago, I have conducted work and research with individuals who have radicalized abroad and developed in that process a model that we call educational displacement theory, or model of radicalization. And that model is the conceptual framework that we wanted within the United States to test and see whether it had validity and whether it was a relevant and informative model for how individuals, young individuals, students radicalize in the US. And so without going into details of the slides that will accompany the next minute or so of my explanation of the model, I do want to, however, highlight the first step in a 10-step process of radicalization that has emerged from these conversations and primary research with individuals who have radicalized. And surprisingly, to many, I think to many educators in particular, the initial step to the radicalization process is this experience or phenomenon of educational displacement. What does educational displacement mean? It means a sense of invisibility, a sense of disengagement, disconnection that students begin to feel in classroom spaces in schools when there's no genuine dialogue, when there is no active engagement by educators, educational staff to address their either individual or group grievances that they might hold. And when that happens, when they feel displaced, and here I want to highlight displacement doesn't mean displaced physically, that they're dropping out. There are many academically highly performing students who radicalize because they are physically in the community, but they have made what we would call mental exit. They do not feel recognized, respected, seen, and heard. And that feeling is what triggers the process of radicalization. Again, there are a number of other steps that we could go through, and those who are watching us will see the slide. They can look at our research. But really, the trigger to radicalization is the sense of educational displacement. So for us, having that understanding and then testing that through data here in the United States, where we collected data on educational displacement from more than 300 educators and 300 students across 40 states, what we were able to observe is high level of educational displacement across various demographic groups. And as a result, we decided to build this professional training program that would basically create a new type of resilience to hate framework. And that framework is envisions resilience as a protective capacity and as a collective capacity in a community. So we often think of resilience as a coping mechanism or coping capacity with which we respond to an act of targeted violence, but we reimagined it as a framework, as a platform that can actually protect community from violence. And so what does that platform consist of? It really consists of 10 courses that we have developed that highlight and build capacities for educators on multiple of protective factors that we know can lessen hate-fueled violence in our schools and our communities. So we focus in the training on building community awareness, self-awareness, building social connectedness, building mentorship capacities between students and educators, peer-to-peer mentorship, media digital literacy, encouraging curiosity and active engagement in addressing one's grievances in a nonviolent way. And in doing that, we have been able to improve the pedagogical approaches and also larger understanding for educators how they can actively work with students to prevent targeted violence. And so one other highlight or lesson that we learned in working with educators is that much of our data showed initially that many educators didn't understand fully that biased language and biased behavior is actually a form of violence, and we call it cultural violence. So narratives of othering, narratives of displacement, dehumanization, narratives of supremacy inflict harm, a notion that Suzanne has discussed as well. And so when we looked at the impact of cultural violence in schools, it manifested in the form of educational displacement. And the next goal for us with Reimagine Resilience was to understand, so who is impacted? If we know that narratives of hate have adverse impact and that manifests for those who are targeted in the form of feeling educationally displaced, are they the only group that is adversely impacted? And what our data shows is that actually whole of society is adversely impacted. Those who are educationally displaced, they're at the higher risk for engaging in targeted violence because they wish to be recognized, seen, to belong, and they might seek other groups outside of the mainstream society to which they can attach their grievances to build that sense of belonging. So that puts them at the higher risk of radicalizing. Then the second group that we wanted to make sure is visible through this professional training program in terms of the adverse impact on them is those who enact educational displacement, whether they're peers who tease someone because of how they look or what their background or some aspect of their identity might be, or educators who might engage in such behavior. So those are educational displacers who themselves are also at a higher risk of engaging in other forms of targeted violence because through processes of dehumanization of certain individuals or group, they are more likely to normalize other forms of targeted violence. And then lastly, when there is a group that is educationally displaced and the society witnesses that, we all are adversely impacted by educational displacement and that violence. And so these are just some of the key notions that I wanted to highlight for those who are watching us today. And in terms of the impact and outcomes of our research and our work and our professional training program, we have trained more than 2,200 educators across the 47 US states. We have not only initially the program was intended to train educators and education professionals, but once we engaged with communities, the demand for the work was and the training was such that we have engaged now with faith leaders, we have engaged with other community leaders, we have engaged with law enforcement, we've been asked by hospitals to come and train their staff, we've been asked by journalists to come and talk about the notion of educational displacement, particularly if they're discussing or writing on education-related issues. How do they make sure that they write in a way that does not displace certain communities?
Share what this grant will help our schools with. Number one, the person who is going to be taking on this job officially started today. Her name is Julia Berry, and she will be the person taking on the authorized rep role. And she will support the 23 schools and charters that have received the grant money. And some of the things that our schools are excited to do and are in partnership with us around are developing and enhancing emergency operations plans, right? That's really important. Modifying approaches to internal discipline tracking. What are we tracking? How are we tracking? And one thing that I think is important is language, right? Language matters in this conversation. How we talk about students' behaviors matters, right? The third thing is purchasing and building programming around anti-bullying, harassment, and abuse. Providing targeted services for students most at risk at schools. So we have ideas from our school community around, can we hire a full-time service community coordinator, right? And they would be in charge of volunteer programs. So schools are really excited to bring in more community members to be part of the school. So when students look around the hallways and they see people they see in community in the building, that there's a stronger connection of who they see in community and who's in the building with them. There's another opportunity for hallway monitor pilot. Again, these are elders in the community. I am so happy to see that there's this intentionality around bringing in, like, maybe I'll see auntie in the hallway, or maybe my grandpa's going to be here at school with us, right? So allowing more of that, those things that were lost before COVID, right? When we went virtual, a lot of those things, I would say many were trying to do those kinds of opportunities for that collaboration. And now here is a chance for our schools to bring back that community in the schools together. And then, of course, adding more community partnerships around anti-violence. There's a lot of student-centered, even groups that have been coming to the state and sharing their projects and sharing their ideas. So student-led groups in community are coming in and sharing, like, how can we participate and be our leaders in our own schools, right?
Can you give one recommendation for the school leaders out there that are thinking about or desire to apply for federal grants? What's something they could do tomorrow to take a step? Suzanne, will you get us started?
Sure. Thank you, Don. I would offer that equity being the center of the conversation is really important. I think what we do, what we think, that bias that we show up with, I think it's really important as a leader to be mindful of how bias shows up and how I, Suzanne, can continue to do better each day by being intentional about equity and creating equity considerations. So that would be my one thing.
Thank you. Yep.
Thank you.
To add to Suzanne's response, if I had to highlight one recommendation, I do know that many schools are intimidated by the process of applying for a federal grant. And we, in one of our federally funded projects, also by CP3, called Project Belonging, are partnering with a number of schools to create programs and support local initiatives designed by students in those schools. I would say if a school is concerned about having capacities to conduct research or capacities to work with the federal agencies, partner with the university in your area. I have personally gotten on a Zoom call with many educators who asked questions about how do I obtain federal funding and what is required, what should I consider? And I've gotten on Zoom calls and given them advice. So seek out those in your community. Feel free to reach out to us at Reimagine Resilience at Columbia University. And we're happy to provide insights and hope that we can uplift your work in your communities, because we need more schools, we need more educators and more students to focus on early prevention of targeted violence and extremism.
Well, for me, I think my best piece of advice for anyone looking at a grant is to think big picture, pie in the sky, something that if you said it to your administrators, they're going to look at you and say, we can never put all those elements together. When you do that, also couple it with how will this lay the foundation for us to carry on the work? Because the last thing you want to happen is for once that grant ends, as we have 3-year terms, the work stops. So instead, look at how the pie in the sky idea that you never really think could go anywhere, but you really wish you could get your teeth into and try, that you actually have the support and foundation laid out in it, but you know how I can keep this as long as I can build from that. So it's making that connection of how you carry on when the grant ends that will make the work be stronger, but use the grant to provide the foundation to make that work as meaningful as possible.